She. It's time to relax now. Let your breath slow down, as if it, too, has grown sleepy from the quiet. Let your arms go soft at your sides or curled gently under your head. Your chest rises and falls, and with each breath your body begins to feel heavier, but not in a bad way, just gently, safely grounded, like soft roots growing into the mattress below you. Let your mind drift like a paper boat on a still pond. Let the ripples carry you. There's nothing you need to do now. No one waiting, just this quiet story, just the flicker of something ancient. A lantern, perhaps, glowing softly on a distant hill. Our story today begins in a place that most have forgotten, but once they say it was watched carefully by many eyes, because it was important, because it was sacred, and because if it was left unattended, something else would come watching instead. The village was called Corlaith, a small thatch-roofed settlement hidden near the bend of a silver river, a place that didn't appear on most maps and didn't welcome strangers. Not out of cruelty, no, but out of caution. A caution passed down like a prayer whispered in darkness. The river that curved like a serpent's spine was called the Ivale, and long ago, when the village first rose from the mud and fog, they said the river was not just water, but something more, something that remembered, something that could speak if you were foolish enough to listen. Corlaith was nestled between misty woods and quiet marsh, and every night when the last bread was eaten and the last ember cooled, the villagers would look up toward the hill. Just a glance, just to be sure. On that hill stood a lantern tower, no more than a wooden post, lashed with iron rings and crowned with an old, weather-worn lantern that always burned, always, even in the rain, even in the wind. And it was your job to keep it lit. They didn't ask you at first. The job of the lantern keeper was never offered. It was chosen. You were 12 when they brought you to the base of the hill. Your mother wept quietly into her apron, but did not speak. Your father kept his eyes low, jaw clenched like a stone in his throat. And the village elder, a woman whose skin was so pale it looked powdered in ash, placed a hand on your shoulder. She said the flame knew who it wanted. And you felt the truth of it. A soft tug beneath your ribs, like someone had whispered your name in a dream. That night they left you with a bundle of dry wood, flint, a lantern key, and a book so old its pages felt like leaves. They told you the rules, quietly, one by one. Do not let the flame die. Do not leave the hill until dawn. Do not look into the river after midnight. And if you hear voices, do not answer them. You thought they were only stories, warnings for a child too young to understand. But you learned quickly. The lantern itself was heavier than it looked, forged from old bronze, stained with soot. You had to climb a short ladder each night to reach it. There, at the top of the hill, wind tangled in your hair, and the trees below rustled like sleepers turning in their beds. The flame inside was soft, almost blue, and it didn't burn like normal fire. It pulsed like a heartbeat, like it knew when you approached. The first week passed quietly. You read by the light. You kept your vigil, but on the 8th night you heard it. The whisper. It came from the riverbank far below, so faint you almost thought it was the wind. It said your name, not once, but 3 times, soft, curious, like someone remembering you. You didn't answer, not that time. By the 2nd month, your world had shrunk. You didn't see the village much anymore, only at sunrise when they brought you bread and water and clean clothes, leaving them at the foot of the hill. No one climbed, not even your parents, not even the elder. You were alone, save for the flame. And the river, it began to change. The river didn't flow the same way anymore. It curved toward the hill, just slightly, and sometimes it shimmered with something dark beneath the surface. Shapes, perhaps, or shadows that swam without sound. The book they gave you had pages filled with strange ink. Some entries were in Latin, others in a language you didn't know, symbols that seemed to shift when you stared too long. But there were drawings, lantern designs, ancient sigils. And one page, one you always avoided, showed the river at night, with pale hands reaching from it. Sometimes you dreamed of those hands. One night, perhaps in your 3rd month or 5th, you lost track of time easily. You dozed off, just briefly. You had lit the lantern, yes, and secured it, but the wind had picked up. A storm was near, and your eyelids were heavy. You awoke to silence. The lantern had gone out, and from the base of the hill, something was crawling. It didn't walk, it didn't run. It crept slow and long and dragging like a body, too tired to pretend it was still human. You struck the flint. Once, twice, your hands trembled, and then the light bloomed again. The crawling thing stopped. Not immediately. No, it took 2 breaths more, as if unwilling, as if frustrated, and then it slipped back into the fog, into the river. You didn't sleep again for days. From then on, you tied the lantern's key to your wrist. You stayed awake even as the hours turned numb. You sang to yourself, whispered stories, prayers, anything to stay tethered. You began to understand what the flame really was, not just light, but a boundary, a line between what belonged in this world and what didn't. The elders never said it aloud, but you knew. You were not keeping the light alive. You were keeping something else from crossing. The days began to blend together after that night. You stopped counting them. It no longer mattered whether it was a Thursday or a Sunday. The hill felt outside of time. You woke when the sun reached the tips of the trees, and you stayed awake long past the stars, your eyes fixed on the lantern's pulse and the soft silver curve of the river. You kept your ears sharp, straining for every shift in the wind. The river was louder somehow. It didn't babble or ripple like before. It hissed, as if something beneath its surface was drawing breath. You lit the first stick of incense and placed it beneath the lantern. The smoke curled upward like a ghost trying to leave the body. It smelled of myrrh and iron and something else, something like charred paper or old blood, letting its pulsing rhythm guide your breath. In. You opened it to find a smooth stone, dark as obsidian, with a single word etched into it. Remember. You didn't recognize the script, but you felt its meaning pulse through your fingertips. From that day forward, the lantern burned a little brighter, as though it had been acknowledged by whatever watched beyond. And from then on, you were never unsure of your role. You were not a caretaker. You were a warden. Out, slow, still. Your heartbeat began to match its flicker. You didn't know if that was safe, but it was necessary, because the flame knew something you didn't, something the villagers had long stopped writing down. The lantern did not merely light the way for souls. It held the gate, it locked the seam. It was not guidance, it was containment. The flame responded immediately. their forms dissolving as if they had never truly existed. The river turned again, flowing in its rightful direction, and the lantern's hum diminished into a gentle whisper. You collapsed beside it, too weak to rise. You slept without dreams that day, your body heavy with spent ritual, your fingers still stained with ash. It flared, not in size but in sound. You'd never known light could hum, but it did, soft at first, then louder, as though the fire had become aware. You felt the vibration beneath your feet, through the hill itself, like distant hooves, or the dragging of something immense through the soil. And then, just at the edge of the trees, you saw them. The flame of the lantern danced higher that night, its blue-white core flickering with restless energy. Pale and thin, barely more than silhouettes, standing motionless in the dark. They were watching, not approaching, not speaking, just waiting. Their eyes, if they had any, were not visible, and yet you felt them pressing against your skin, your ribs, the back of your skull. The incense burned low, and you placed the second stick quickly, choking on the thickness of the scent. The smoke wrapped around you, wrapping your clothes, your hair, and even the lantern itself until it looked more like a ghost than a flame. One of the figures moved just slightly a head tilt or a shifting of weight. The sound that followed was not a word, but it echoed like one, low, ancient, buried deep within the earth. You knelt before it, clutching the incense in one hand and the flint in the other, unsure whether it was time. But the water below made the decision for you. When the moon reached its highest point, the veil shimmered with an unnatural glow, and for the first time in your life, it reversed direction. In the morning, the village would leave you a fresh loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, and a jug of water that always seemed to taste faintly of iron, like the well itself had begun remembering something buried too deep. You never saw their faces any more, only glimpses. A foot retreating behind a tree, a cart's wheel creaking in the distance. Even your parents no longer waved. At first it hurt, but eventually you began to understand. The villagers did not look at you because they were afraid to know if you were still the same, afraid to see the change in your eyes, and maybe afraid to let you see the change in theirs. One afternoon, long before twilight, the elder came. It had been months since you'd heard her voice, and it seemed thinner now, more fragile. She did not climb the hill, only stood at its base, her shawl pulled tightly around her bones. She called up to you, voice breaking the stillness. She said only this: "The tide has shifted. Burn the incense." Then she was gone, vanishing into the trees as quietly as she had arrived. You didn't even have time to ask what she meant. You hadn't been told about incense. You searched the box where the bread was delivered and found, this time, something different nestled beneath the cloth. A small clay bowl, 3 sticks of blackened incense wrapped in waxy parchment, and a note written in that same brittle ink that the book of the lantern bore. It read, "Only when the water turns." You didn't sleep that night, not even for a moment. The river turned. With trembling hands, figures. You did not look away from the lantern. That was the most important rule now. You kept your eyes on the flame as dawn broke and the final stick of incense curled to ash. The figures faded into mist. When you awoke, there was something resting beside you, a token wrapped in burlap. The weeks that followed blurred into something like ritualized sleepwalking. You moved through your tasks with careful, automatic grace. Chopped the kindling, stoke the fire, wipe the soot from the bronze, check the lock on the lantern gate. The messages left at the base of the hill had grown shorter. Not silhouettes this time, but clearer, more certain. Figures that moved with slow grace beneath the water's surface, pale limbs floating like reeds, eyes unblinking and wide. They didn't thrash or reach, just drifted, watching the hill, watching you. It began as a soft bell, no louder than a chime stirred by wind. You assumed, at first, it was from the village chapel, perhaps a nighttime prayer ritual. What the bell tolled at odd hours. 3 quick notes before midnight. The page edges sticking together as if trying to hide their contents. But you forced them apart one by one. And there it was. A single phrase at the top of a blank page. When they knock, do not let them answer themselves. You didn't understand what it meant. The water was above your head, rippling and silver, but you were on a path of stone and bone that wound down into caverns lit by the same pale light that burned in your lantern. You followed the sound of whispering voices, low and layered, too many to belong to any one throat. They spoke in echoes and riddles, and lullabies that sounded like dirges. Not fully. It simply asked, again and again, do you remember who you were before the flame chose you? But you knew it was not a warning. It was a rule. A slow echoing peal just before dawn. Then silence. Always the same pattern. Never during the day. And soon you realized it wasn't coming from the chapel at all. They moved as though carried not by the current, but by intent. Fewer words, less warmth. The last one, left in trembling charcoal strokes, had read only, "The shadows under the water are older than the town." You didn't write it down in the book. You didn't even whisper it aloud. Some truths were better sealed. But from then on, like the creaking of a tree limb in the wind, you told yourself it was nothing. You repeated this each night, even as the knock returned, closer each time. 3 slow raps one evening. A quick double tap the next, always from a different direction. Once from beneath your feet, once from the base of the ladder. You never saw who or what was knocking, but by the time the 15th knock came, you stopped pretending. You began tracing protective circles in salt around the base of the lantern before each lighting. You scattered iron nails at the 4 corners of the hill. You hammered an iron spike into the soil where the knocking had sounded loudest. And when the tapping came clear and crisp and unmistakable, you whispered, "I hear you, but I do not welcome you." And then, just as softly, "Let the fire stand between us." You don't know why you said those words. They weren't in the book, but the flame heard you. It flared blue and bright, and for a moment the air around the hill grew so still, so painfully still that even the insects stopped humming. You began sleeping with the book tucked beneath your head, its presence a brittle kind of comfort, like the sharp edge of a knife held in the dark. You reread it until the parchment frayed at the edges, then burned it in the lantern's base like the others. Moss crept higher up the lantern post, and the ladder groaned more loudly than it used to. You often felt as though something had followed you back down after your climb, though whenever you turned, you were alone. That was part of the practice. Now no paper was allowed to remain, no relics of communication. Words carried memory, and memory was a doorway. Tie the key to your wrist with twine soaked in wine and herbs. Read a passage from the book and burn 1 leaf from the sacred bundle left at your feet each Monday morning. These were the things that kept the border closed, the light alive, and the hills safe, or so you believed. Yet, each time the river curved too sharply, or the fog rose too early, you felt a nudge in your chest, a presence not quite physical, not quite spiritual, like the hill itself was breathing with you, or against you. The villagers spoke to you less, even in writing. It was the 16th full moon since your first night as keeper when you finally saw them again, the river's shapes. That night you lit the incense without hesitation. You didn't need to wait for signs anymore. You felt them inside you now. The wind would shift, and your breath would falter. Your bones would grow cold even while your skin remained warm. That was how you knew the veil had thinned. That was how you knew the light must rise. The hill had changed, too, subtly. The grass had darkened to a deeper green, and the soil seemed to retain footprints for longer. But most disturbing of all was the sound. It was coming from beneath the hill. You didn't tell the villagers. Then came the knocking. It started as a single tap, faint and distant. The book had a chapter you'd never dared to open before. Its spine resisted when you reached for it. You circled the lantern post that night with twice the salt. After that night, the knocking ceased, but in its place came the dreams. In them, you were walking beneath the river. Not in it, beneath it. One voice always rose above the others. A child's voice, soft and clear. It never begged. It never cried. You never answered. And you never reached the end of the path. You always woke just before. The dreams lingered longer each time now, like footprints that refused to fade. Even in the daylight, you could still feel them curled around the edges of your vision. You would find yourself staring too long at the patterns in the bark of trees, thinking you saw faces. The elder returned. This time she came further, not ghosts. Your hand trembling. The image was gone, but the sensation of having been seen did not leave you. The flame in the lantern had shifted in color. Not blue now, but a shimmering violet that pulsed slowly, like a breath drawn in and held. You didn't sleep that night, and you felt a ripple of cold press against your spine. Something was wrong. The smoke from the incense wasn't rising. It was moving sideways, pulled by an unseen breath. You turned slowly, heart-thudding, tangible, draped in something long and wet, like a burial shroud. Its face was hidden, but its presence was heavy. It stood unmoving, staring up at the lantern. At you, you knew instinctively what it was. Not a ghost. Not a villager. It was a herald, and saw a single figure at the base of the hill. You couldn't. To hide, to scream, but your body knew better. The hill wouldn't let you flee. The lantern would not allow its keeper to abandon the gate. And somewhere, the mirror rested beside you, face down in the grass, but you felt its weight like an open eye. Not exactly. And then, villagers, soldiers, something faceless, as if it were deciding something, sunken and silvered with time. The weather turned. Sometimes they came while you were awake, brushing your thoughts like drifting cobwebs. A voice might murmur just behind your shoulder your name, always your name. Shapes moved just outside your vision. The river's hum was no longer distant. It was under your skin. You were no longer merely the lantern keeper. The hill had taken you deeper than that. Summer bent toward autumn, and the nights grew colder. The fog thickened earlier in the evening, and the trees seemed to lean closer to the hill with each passing week. The villagers' offerings grew scarcer. Some days they left nothing at all. On one occasion, you descended the hill to find no tracks in the dirt, no footprints, as though no one had come. You wondered if perhaps they had stopped believing, or worse, if they had forgotten. But when you looked toward the village from your perch that evening, you could see their chimneys smoking, their lanterns glowing like fireflies below. They were still there, still watching, just no longer part of the story they had once entrusted to you. She didn't bring bread or salt or notes. Instead, she carried a single item wrapped in cloth, a mirror, small, oval, and rimmed in copper, darkened by age. You'd hear the creak of branches and flinch, half expecting the knock to return, but it never did. Then finally, watching the sky. And then, on the seventh night, the moon rose swollen and rust-colored, as though stained with blood. You climbed the ladder and lit the lantern as always, but this time you brought the mirror. You held it high, angling its surface toward the flame. What reflected back was not your face, not the lantern, not even the hill. Her voice cracked like old bark. Hold it up on the next red moon. Face it to the flame. You will see what walks between. You opened your mouth to ask what she meant, but she was already turning away, her shawl fluttering behind her like a faded banner. Whatever had tested the hill's edge had been pushed back for now, yet you sensed its presence had not withdrawn entirely. It waited just beyond, watching with patience that only the ancient possess. And deep down, a part of you feared it wasn't only the lantern holding the boundary. It was you. Something had shifted the night you spoke aloud. Something old had noticed. You began recording the dreams in the margins of the book, though it felt wrong to do so. The pages reacted to ink strangely now. Letters bled at the edges, refusing to dry. Some turned into symbols you hadn't written. One word even vanished entirely, leaving only a greasy smudge. The book was no longer passive. It was listening. It was responding. And you didn't know what it wanted you to learn or forget. One fog-drenched morning, she handed it to you without a word. You waited days. You saw water deep and black in the pale figures that drifted within it. But clearer this time. You lowered the mirror. You began to notice changes in yourself, subtle but undeniable. Your dreams no longer followed sleep. One evening, as you lit the incense and recited the passage from memory you no longer needed the book, you paused midway. The flame flickered. It wasn't moving, it wasn't speaking, but it was there. Unlike the drifting shades you'd seen before, this one was solid. Something was coming. You wanted to run, you remained still. The river whispered behind it. The weeks after the figure's appearance passed in an uneasy hush, as though the entire world were holding its breath. Even the wind changed, no longer playful, no longer whistling through the grass like a flute at dusk. It moved low to the ground now, crawling rather than rushing, slinking along the edges of the hill like a hunting thing. You learned to find fuel in strange places, twisting root clusters from beneath the hill, long-burning moss wrapped in cloth, a strange wax left in a parcel at your feet one cold morning that smelled faintly of lavender and blood. You learned not to ask questions about your supplies. They arrived when needed, and they always burned long enough. That was all that mattered now. Birds avoided the peak entirely. Deer stopped coming near the clearing. The forest held back its usual chatter, and the sky, while still blue by day, seemed to hang a little heavier, like a roof sagging under old snow. You did not sleep often, and when you did, it was only in thin, flickering slivers of rest, short as candle stubs. The notes weren't human. Not entirely. Some of them came too fast, others too slow, warping time like heat over stone. Of course you did. You only returned to the lantern and added 3 more sticks of incense, lighting each with a trembling hand. The smoke thickened around the flame, painting your face in soft gray ribbons. You recited the entire first passage of the book twice. Then you knelt before the lantern and whispered one word, again and again, but the air was still. The ground was undisturbed, and when you looked closer, you found something that froze the breath in your lungs. Small bear pressed deep into the soil beside your bedroll. 2 now, side by side, angled toward the lantern. The following evening there were 4, then 6. They circled the flame in a wide loop, never closer than a few feet, but always there, watching, waiting. Unmarked, it sang of those who had come before you, keepers whose bones had become part of the hill, whose eyes still watched through the cracks in the stone. It sang of something beneath the water that had waited for centuries, patient and dreaming, locked behind a door of fire and flesh. And yet the lantern remained lit. You were drawn from a shallow sleep by a smell, not the sweet sting of incense nor the iron-soaked breath of the river. This was different, earthy, pungent. The crack was gone, not filled in, not healed. Gone as if it had never been there. Alive, it was soil, freshly turned. You rose slowly and stepped out into the mist, the flame flickering gently behind you. That was when you saw the earth had split. The book grew restless. Wide enough to swallow a hand had formed at the base of the hill. The grass around it had yellowed as though scorched by something that never touched it. The scent of rot rose from the opening, soft at first, then stronger, like fruit left too long in the heat. You peered into the crack, 10 stones, 15, 20. With each one you allowed yourself a single breath of hope. Perhaps the incense had worked. Perhaps the flame had closed what tried to open. Perhaps your whispered prayer had held more power than you understood. But it was too deep to see the bottom. And yet you felt something rising. Not air, not wind. Something slower, heavier. A breath. Exhaled. Its pages no longer stayed still when closed. At times it would lie open when you returned to your post, as though something had turned it in your absence. Words shifted on the page, ink bleeding toward the center, pulling into spirals you could almost understand. The language that once baffled you now whispered meanings you felt in your chest instead of your ears. One phrase came up again and again, first in ink, then in your dreams, then carved into the back of the mirror's copper frame. The keeper becomes the gate. You tried not to think about what that meant. You focused on the task. Keep the light steady. Keep the incense burning. Keep your name from your lips. And then the river changed again. Not a tide shift this time. Not a glow or a shimmer. It began to sing. The sound was so low it was almost felt rather than heard, like a cello played through the soles of your feet. But you listened. It sang of memory, and it sang of cracks in that door. One night, a crack, you didn't speak. Stay. That morning, but you knew it had. You also knew it would return. You began marking the days in the dirt with small stones, one for each night the crack did not reappear. The pile grew slowly, steadily, but on the 24th night the stone you placed was gone by morning, not moved, not scattered, gone. You searched the hilltop, circling the base twice, looking for signs of animals or weather. A footprint, too small to be an adult's, far too small to be yours. The same footprint appeared again the next night, this time accompanied by another. You never saw who made them, but you felt them, not malevolent, not quite, just curious, and hungry in a way that went beyond food. You stopped erasing the footprints. At first, it had been instinctual brushing them away at sunrise, smoothing the dirt with your palm, pretending they had never been there. But now you left them, a quiet testament to your uninvited guests. Each morning brought more, a silent ring of impressions that shifted subtly with the changing winds, always reappearing before dawn, never overlapping, never trampling each other. They moved with purpose, careful and precise. Whoever or whatever left them seemed bound by some unspoken rule. They would not touch the lantern. Not yet, and so you let them be. The book began responding again, not in the margins, not with ink, but with weight. Some nights it would grow heavier, the leather binding pressing hard against your chest as you slept. Other nights it felt almost weightless, as if it were hollowed out or waiting to be filled. You suspected it had begun feeding on something you could not name intent, perhaps, or the attention of the things that now circled your flame. Its pages fluttered without wind. Its binding creaked in time with the river's murmur. And the mirror would no longer reflect you. Each time you looked into it, you saw pieces of the hill, the base, the path, the fog-covered trees, but never yourself. The flame appeared in its center like a dull, floating orb, and around it, movement. Blurred shapes, half-formed hands, faces hidden in veils of smoke. Sometimes the glass would fog over without cause, and when you wiped it clean, a handprint, small, damp, childlike, would be visible from the inside. You stopped cleaning it after that. You still spoke to the lantern, not in words always, but in whispers, in breath. You learned its moods. It burned tall when danger neared, shrank when calm returned. Its light no longer merely revealed, it shielded, it called. You no longer wondered what it called to. That answer lived beneath the water. You knew now that the lantern was not alone in its watching. You were not the only sentinel. There were others, some hidden, some forgotten, some sealed in places where no prayers reached. You had glimpsed them in dreams, hilltops crowned with twin flames, marshes lit by floating blue lights, coastal cliffs where bells rang with no wind to stir them. You were not alone, but you were still the only one here. On the 32nd night since the mirror's arrival, the flame dimmed without cause. There was no wind, no moisture, no break in the incense. And yet, as the moon rose behind thin veils of cloud, the blue light within the bronze cage began to flicker in a way you had never seen. You climbed the ladder slowly, your hands trembling on each rung, not from cold, but from recognition something had crossed a threshold. You opened the cage, held your breath, and looked down into the flame. Inside the glass you saw not fire, but an eye, lidless, wide, burning with soft cerulean light. It looked back at you, calm, eternal, watching as though it had been waiting for you to notice. You didn't scream. You didn't speak. You simply lowered the cage door and stepped back down the ladder in silence. The flame pulsed once, strong and even, then returned to its normal rhythm. The eye was gone, but you knew it hadn't left. It had only blinked. That night the knocking returned, not sharp, not urgent, soft, rhythmic, as though someone were tapping a lullaby against the wood of the ladder. You didn't rise. You didn't answer. You simply rolled onto your side, facing the lantern, and whispered, "Not tonight. Please, not tonight." The knocking stopped, but in its absence the silence deepened. Not a peaceful silence, but one stretched taut, like old rope groaning under strain. You could feel it pressing against your ribs, against the soles of your feet. The hill was listening again. The river, watching. The dreams that followed were colder. Gone were the endless paths and the humming doorways. Now you stood before a wall of black water, rising endlessly into the sky, and behind it, shapes, tall, unmoving, wrapped in chains that pulsed like veins. You heard their names in your sleep, but forgot them the moment you opened your eyes. Only one name remained, yours. Not the name your parents had given you, not the name you spoke as a child, a different name, older, etched into stone. Written in the book's final, blank page 1, you had never dared to open until now. That name glowed faintly under moonlight, only visible when traced with your fingertip, pulsing warm beneath your touch. It was the name of the first keeper, the original, and somehow, impossibly, it was yours. Not a namesake, not a descendant. The same. The realization came not with fear, but with stillness. A strange acceptance that settled deep into your bones, like warmth near a dying fire. You were not chosen at 12 years old. You were remembered, recalled, called back. This was not your first hill, not your first flame. You had walked this path before, and you would walk it again, because the lantern remembers. And now, so do you. From the moment you traced your name in the book's final page, the hill no longer felt like something you stood upon. It felt like something you were part of. The grass bent beneath your feet, not in submission, but in welcome. The trees no longer kept their distance. When the wind passed through their branches, it carried not just leaves, but murmurs, words you almost understood, fragments of lullabies and ritual chants, things older than the village and older than even the book. You no longer feared the hill's silence. It was no longer empty. It was full with memories, with echoes, with the hush of all who had stood where you now stood, tending the flame. You found yourself speaking less, thinking more in images and feelings, drawn deeper into the rhythms of your station. There was a reverence in every action, now placing the incense bowl, checking the oil, adjusting the glass plates of the lantern with care, as if caressing the cheek of something that dreamt while awake. The flame responded to you more quickly. It flickered in patterns that matched your thoughts. Some nights it pulsed in time with your heartbeat. Other nights you felt your pulse shift to match it instead. You no longer knew which came first. And yet, for all the peace that began to root within you, something darker began to stir at the river's edge. The figures had grown braver. They no longer lingered behind trees. They walked openly now, barefoot, their robes dragging through the wet grass as if heavy with water. Their faces remained indistinct, blotted by shadow or veil, but their eyes, those you could see clearly, pale, luminous, watching. Each evening they gathered at the same hour, standing silently at the base of the hill, encircling it like mourners at a grave. They made no move to ascend. They never spoke, but the pressure of their presence was unbearable. You could feel it through your skin, a quiet demand. We remember you. Do you remember us? You didn't answer aloud, but part of you did remember. Not details, not names or voices or the clasp of their hands, but shapes, feelings, faces once familiar, now blurred by centuries of forgetting. They had stood beside you once, or perhaps behind you, watching as you climbed the hill alone. Perhaps they had taken your place for a time, and you had watched them, just as they now watched you. The thought didn't frighten you. What frightened you was how natural it felt. That night you lit the mirror with the flame. You had never done so before, never dared to let the fire touch it. But something inside you, an old instinct, told you it was time. You struck the flint once, then again, and as the spark leapt from stone to wick, you angled the glass toward the lantern's core. The moment the light struck the mirror's surface, the flame split into two, not in the air, but in the reflection. One flame burned blue, the other red, and between them something moved. It was not a figure. It was not human. It was not animal. It was shape and shadow and suggestion, a thing with no edges, no eyes, no name. But it looked at you, and as it did, your breath slowed, your chest heavy not with fear, but with gravity, as though the space between you and that reflection had become thicker, filled with centuries of unspoken memory. You held the mirror steady, your arms aching. The figure in the mirror lifted something, its hand or its shadow, and pointed downward toward the base of the hill. The book slid open beside you, not fluttering, not blown by wind. It moved as if by command, its pages rustling to a chapter you had never seen, one written in a thin, rust-colored ink. The text was not written across the page, but in a spiral, coiling inward like a whirlpool. At the center of the spiral was a single symbol, a door, bound in chain, wrapped in flame. You traced it with your finger and felt warmth rise through your arm. The mirror darkened, the flame stilled, and far below, at the edge of the river, a door opened. You did not see it swing. You did not see what passed through, but you felt it, the way you feel a thunderclap in your spine before you hear it, the way the air changes just before lightning splits the sky. Something crossed the threshold, something old, and it did not climb the hill. It entered the water. For the first time in months, the river was silent. Not still, silent. Not a ripple, not a whisper. Just the great, impossible hush of a world holding its breath. And then you heard it. Not a knock, not a voice, a heartbeat. Not yours. The flame in the lantern mirrored it, pulsing slowly, steadily, with the deep, rhythmic thump of something vast and submerged. It echoed through the soil, into your bones, into the book, into the mirror, into the hill itself. The heartbeat of what sleeps beneath the veil. The heartbeat faded slowly, like a drum line retreating into mist, but its echo remained, stitched into the soil and coiled beneath your skin. You no longer felt alone on the hill. Not in the way you had before, not the kind of solitude that comes with silence or shadow. This was something deeper. It was the sense of being surrounded by presences just beyond the edge of perception, not all hostile, not all familiar, but none of them human. The villagers did not return. No more bread wrapped in linen. No more candles or incense left at the hill's base. Their offerings had ceased, as if their contract with the flame had expired, or perhaps been fulfilled. You wondered if they even remembered the hill now, whether they still looked up toward the light each evening. or whether the presence at the river's edge had turned their gazes inward, away from the flame, away from you. You had not left your post in weeks, perhaps longer. The concept of time had grown soft, like damp parchment. The days blurred into one another, marked only by the rhythm of the flame and the thickening fog. You began to see the hill in your dreams again, but not as it was. You saw it in summer, in bloom, with children running through tall grass and laughter in the air. You saw it in winter, white and still, with monks dragging torches up its side to pray beneath the stars. You saw it in fire and flood and shadow, always the same place, always the same flame. But the keepers changed. Hundreds of them, men, women, elders, children, all dressed in the same faded robes, all climbing the hill alone, all lighting the lantern with the same careful motion you had once thought was yours alone. Each dream folded inward until the faces blurred and overlapped, and then you saw yourself again, standing atop the hill, not as you were now, but as you had once been, and as you would be again. You were the first. You were the last. The book did not resist your hands anymore. Its pages opened willingly, as though finally recognizing your claim. It no longer bled ink or warped words. Instead, it hummed faintly when touched, a sound so low you felt it more in your fingertips than your ears. Its final pages revealed symbols you had seen before only in your dreams, loops within loops, flames that spiraled into eyes, names written backward and upside down. One name appeared again and again, Anari. You didn't know what it meant. Perhaps it was the name of the flame. Perhaps it was yours before you had been born. You whispered it one night while placing fresh incense, and the lantern pulsed so brightly it turned the grass silver. The river stilled. The fog paused mid-drift. The stars above dimmed slightly, as though bowing to the sound. You did not speak the name again after that. You feared what else might hear it. And then came the child. You saw her first in the mirror, a girl no older than 8, standing at the base of the hill, barefoot, pale, wearing a shift of rough-spun wool and nothing more. Her hair was wet, stringy with river water, and clung to her cheeks like seaweed. She did not blink. She did not breathe. She only stared upward, into the flame. You turned from the mirror and looked toward the path, but she was not there. When you returned your gaze to the glass, she had moved closer, now halfway up the hill. Still staring, still silent, your heart beat once, hard, then slowed. You raised the mirror a third time. She now stood at the foot of the ladder. But when you looked down, there was nothing. The book flipped open on its own to a page that had once been blank. Across the parchment, in thin, perfect lines, was a sketch. The hill, the lantern, and the child arms raised toward the flame, mouth open wide. Beneath the drawing was a single sentence, written in a language that had no alphabet, but which you understood nonetheless. Only those who were lost in the river can speak through the mirror. You lowered the glass and felt the presence fade. The air grew warm again. The fog pulled back toward the trees. The flame dimmed to its usual hum. But that night, for the first time since taking your post, you wept. Not out of fear, not even from sorrow, but from a deep, aching sense of memory, not of your own life, but of every life touched by this hill, every child offered to the flame, every keeper who came before and would come again. You had become more than yourself. You were a vessel now, a thread in a vast, burning tapestry that stretched backward through time and forward into something nameless. The wind whispered again as you drifted to sleep beside the flame, wrapping your body in warmth and earth. But the whisper did not speak your name. It spoke hers, Anari. The name lingered in your mind long after the wind carried it away. It clung to the air like smoke, not spoken again, but felt beneath the ribs, behind the eyes, somewhere deep and unlit. The next morning, when the dew still lay heavy on the grass and the village below remained a blur behind the mist, you walked a full circle around the hill, slowly, carefully. It had become a habit now, part of your ritual. But this time you noticed something different. Beneath the base of the lantern pole, a small patch of ground had begun to cave in, like soil disturbed from below. You didn't dig, you didn't touch it, but you stood above it and you listened. There was no wind, no bird song, no sound at all, only a faint rhythm, like fingers brushing stone, or breath beneath earth. You whispered a blessing into the air, not from the book, not from the villagers, but one you didn't know, you remembered until it passed your lips. A prayer in a language you did not speak, soft and round and ancient. The soil shifted, but did not break. That night the mere remained dark. No child, no river, no reflection, just a depthless black that did not accept the flame. It swallowed the light and gave nothing in return. And yet you held it close, as though the absence itself was a comfort. Sometimes silence is not a void, but a closing of eyes, a kind of sleep. You dreamt of the child again, but not as a watcher. This time she stood beside you. You both stared into the lantern together, hands not touching, but close. She spoke a single sentence in your dream, just one. You were the first to leave the door open. You didn't ask what she meant. In the dream, you remembered. It was a different hill long ago, the same flame, the same mirror. You had hesitated, just for a breath, just long enough for something to slip through, and the door had never fully shut again. You woke with your hands wrapped around the book, not holding it, clutching it, as though trying to keep something inside from slipping out. From that night forward, you began reinforcing the rituals, tripling the incense, burning herbs you hadn't touched in months, withered sprigs of wolfsbane and dried bone fern that turned the air thick and spiced. You lit the lantern earlier. You sang to it, though no one had ever taught you the songs. They came from the earth beneath your feet, rising up through memory and marrow. And the lantern responded. It no longer flickered. It thrummed. It held steady even through wind, even when the fog grew so dense you couldn't see your own hands. The flame burned with the confidence of a guardian who had finally remembered its post. But with that strength came something new, a sound beneath the sound. The river still whispered. The hill still hummed. But beneath it all, a ticking, not mechanical, not like a clock, more organic, like a heartbeat segmented by ritual. 1, 2, 3. Pause, then again, as though a countdown had begun, and you didn't know to what. The figures around the base of the hill grew more restless. They no longer stood still. They moved always counterclockwise, pacing the foot of the hill like monks in mourning. Sometimes they touched the ground. Sometimes they bent low to whisper into the soil. You never heard what they said. But each time they finished, the ground felt colder, heavier, less like earth, and more like waiting. One night, you awoke to the scent of burned iron. The flame was still lit, but the incense had blackened entirely, reduced to charcoal before its time. The mirror lay cracked beside you, a thin line running through its surface like a spider's leg, and on the glass, traced in condensation, was a new mark. Not a symbol, not a word, a single handprint, child-sized, as though pressed from within. The book opened on its own, not to a page, but to the binding. Something slipped out, a scrap of cloth you had never seen before, old, frayed, and damp. Sewn into its edge in trembling threads were two initials, and you didn't speak. You didn't breathe. You only placed it beside the incense bowl and sat in silence until dawn. The world did not end. The river did not rise. But something had shifted, as though whatever was beneath the hill had moved in its sleep. You no longer marked the days. You didn't need to. The rhythm of the hill had replaced the calendar, and the lantern's breathing flame had become the only measure of time you trusted. Its pulses were more reliable than sunrises, more meaningful than moons. You could sense when the tide of something unseen had shifted. You could feel the breath of old things brushing the grass. There was no longer any line between duty and identity. You were the keeper. You had always been the keeper. The book remained open now, perpetually turned to a single blank page. But sometimes, when you weren't watching, marks would appear ash gray, strokes like charcoal sketches in motion. Once you saw a doorway appear and vanish in a blink. Another time you caught a glimpse of the hill itself, as seen from above, with thin lines branching outward in all directions like veins. The image faded before your eyes, as if the book were shy, revealing truths only in passing. One morning, just before dawn, you found a drawing etched so faintly it was nearly invisible, your own face, younger, eyes closed, mouth open. Below it, the same initials as the cloth scrap. A.N. You tried not to speak that name again. The last time you had whispered it, the flame had recoiled sharply, dimming as though startled. Whatever Anari meant, whatever you once were, it was not meant to be called aloud. It was a memory that carried weight, and the hill had begun to buckle slightly under it, and still the pacing figures came, the rituals evolved. One night you saw them dragging something behind them, something wrapped in wool, bound at the ankles and wrists with thorn vine. It did not move. You watched. From the hilltop, frozen, you could not descend. The rules were clear. The flame must not be left, but your fingers curled around the edges of the book, and your breath hitched as the figures lowered the object onto the path. They did not touch the flame. They never even looked up. But when morning came, the bundle was gone, and in its place, a new page had appeared in the book. This one was written in liquid rust, its symbols angular and trembling. You traced one line with your finger and felt something behind your eyes twitch, like a memory stirred too soon. You closed the book and buried it in moss until nightfall dot. There were moments of peace still, times when the air felt light and the wind carried only the scent of earth and wood smoke, times when the river flowed without whispering, and the fog receded to the edges of the trees like a sleeping beast. In those moments you sat with your back against the lantern pole and let yourself breathe, not shallow or careful, but deep and true. You sometimes imagined the hill as it must have been long ago when the first keeper had stood here. Perhaps you were that keeper. Perhaps every flame was the same, burning through lifetimes. Perhaps time was not a line but a circle one that always led you back to the top of this hill. The cracked mirror grew dimmer with each passing night. Its surface no longer showed figures. Now it showed only the flame, flickering deeper and deeper into its own reflection, as though trying to escape itself. You covered it with cloth. You did not bury it. You could not. And the flame began to hum, not always, not during lighting, but in the hours between dusk and true night. The lantern's pulse would deepen, vibrating through the wood of the ladder, through the ground, through your chest. Sometimes it matched the rhythm of your breath. Other times it moved just out of sync, like a second heartbeat trying to take over. You began to wonder whether the flame had always been fire, or whether it had once been something else, something alive. One night you heard music, faint, far away, a stringed instrument, soft as moonlight. The melody came from the woods beyond. The river slow, sad, almost childlike. You could not place the tune. It felt like something you had once known, a lullaby, hummed by a mother whose face you no longer remembered. You closed your eyes and let the notes drift over the hill, and for the first time in months the pacing figures below stopped moving. They stood still, heads bowed toward the sound, as though in reverence. The music ended with a final pluck of string, and then silence again. When you woke the next morning, the book was closed. The mirror was whole. The earth around the lantern had been swept clean of footprints, as though the hill itself had drawn a breath and released it. But as you looked up toward the sky, a shadow passed over the sun. Not a cloud, not a bird, something larger. You did not see its shape, only its absence. A cold flicker ran through the flame, and you knew then something had begun to move beyond the veil, something older than memory, older than flame, and far, far closer than it had ever been before. In the hours after the shadow passed, the hill did not move. The wind did not return. The river stayed quiet, almost deliberately so, as though refusing to stir lest it reveal what now swam beneath. The silence was not peace. It was presence. You knew it in your bones the way animals do before a storm. Something had changed in the balance. The lantern was still lit. The ritual still held. But the space beyond the veil had begun leaning forward, watching, breathing against the boundary. You did not sleep that night. You lay on your side, the book open beside you, though no longer to be read. It had become a companion, now more than a text. You had stopped seeing it as a thing made by human hands. It was too knowing, too sentient in its stillness. You kept it close, but not too close. There was always a quiet understanding between you and the book. It would not open unless you needed it, and you would not turn its final pages until the flame asked you to. The figures did not appear for 3 nights. No footprints, no pacing, only fog and grass and a hush of stilled breath. You missed them. Not their forms, not their silence, but their rhythm. Their circling had become part of your watch. Like the tolling of a bell in a forgotten monastery, they gave time shape. Without them, the hours unraveled. You lost track of when to light the incense, of how long to sit. You lit the lantern at dusk, as always, but the sky no longer changed. The way it used to, the stars came slower. The moon shifted behind clouds that never moved. On the 4th night, something returned, but not the watcher's dot this time. It was light, faint, colorless, a glow without a source, rising from the edge of the river like mist that had forgotten to be vapor. It curled upward in long tendrils, not toward the hill, but toward the sky, like smoke being drawn in reverse. It didn't move quickly. It didn't pulse. It simply ascended steadily, as though answering a call only it could hear. You stood beside the lantern and watched as the glow rose past the treetops, vanishing into the cloud-thick sky. The book whispered when you touched it that night, not in words, but in pressure, as though pushing gently against your hand. It opened not to the middle, not to a fresh page, but to the very front of first parchment, where once there had only been inked symbols and title marks. Now there was writing, the first entry, a letter. You read it slowly, aloud, your voice soft, almost uncertain, as though disturbing something asleep. To the one who remembers, if you are reading this, you have stood the vigil longer than the first fire intended. You are still the gate, but the gate has widened. This is not failure. This is recognition. You have become what the flame could not. Flesh-shaped into threshold. When the third mirror breaks, you must choose. Remain as the vessel or pass through and become flame yourself. Either choice seals the boundary. Either choice ends the circle. But choose. Before the sun forgets you, you let the page close on. Its own. It did so like a sigh. You did not speak for the rest of the night. In the morning, you searched the hilltop for signs of mirrors. You only had the one cracked, veiled in cloth, never fully looked into again since the child's touch. But you now understood that there had once been others, perhaps buried, perhaps broken already, perhaps watching from behind the very trees you slept beside. You began walking the hill's slope, each dusk, feeling with your feet, with your hands, listening for hollow spaces in the earth. 3 nights passed before you found it, a ring of stone buried beneath tangled ivy, so shallow in the soil it brushed your fingertips as you swept away the moss. You cleared the space with care. There, nestled in the center, half consumed by rot and leaf, lay a second mirror, whole, untouched. You didn't lift it. You only stared. Its surface was black as oil, and deeper than it should have been, a pool of shadow wrapped in glass. It did not show the sky. It did not show you. It only waited. You sat beside it until dawn, not praying, not watching, just being with. The mirror, with the hill, with the flame flickering behind you like a heartbeat you no longer questioned. And when the sun returned, nothing changed. No wind, no river movement, no watchers. Only the soft hum of a flame that was no longer just fire. You whispered to the mirror that night, not words of power or warding, not ancient chants, but your name, the name they had given you when you were born, the one you had almost forgotten. And the mirror moved. The mirror did not shift in the way a thing of glass and weight should. It rippled, as if the surface were no longer solid, but water with memory. When you whispered your name, the true one, the first one, you felt the syllables dissolve into the air like salt. The mirror accepted it without resistance, without echo. And then, slowly, an image bloomed. Not a face. Not yours. Not the child's. A door. Massive. Arched. Made of black wood veined with flame. Bound in rusted metal, its hinges weeping something dark. You couldn't see what lay behind it, but you could feel the temperature shift. Even through the glass, even through the earth, you knew this door was not meant to be opened. And yet it was not locked, Dot. It waited, Dot. The mirror pulsed once and went still. That night, the lantern burned lower than ever before. Not dim, not weak, but tight, as if it were drawing itself inward, preparing for something. The incense would not catch. The flame rejected it. You tried again with new herbs, with sacred oils. Still nothing. The air did not stir. It became thick, as though time had stalled. And then, for the first time, the lantern spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but in sensation. You placed your palm on the base, and a wave of understanding moved up your arm like warm smoke. Prepare the gate. You didn't need to ask what it meant, Dot. At sunrise, you began to dig, not with tools, but with your hands, nails splitting, fingers trembling, earth soft as breath. Just below the topsoil, you uncovered the third mirror. Shattered, Dot. A dozen fragments. All dark, all curved inward, like they had broken, not from impact, but from within. When you tried to lift one shard, your fingertips burned not from heat, but from recognition. Each shard showed not the hill, not the river, not your face, but memories, flickering across the glass like trapped birds. The child, the door, the other keepers. Your face in different lives, different years, with different names, but always the same eyes. And then, nothing. The flame stopped, Dot. Not flickered. Not dimmed, Dot. Stopped, Dot. You did not panic. You did not move. You simply waited. The silence that followed was deeper than absence. It was intention. It was awareness, Dot, and then from the base of the hill, a soft sound, a bell, clear, hollow, echoing up through the fog. You knew the sound. You had heard it before long ago in dreams of plagued years, when watchers tied bells to the wrists of the nearly dead. You knew what it meant. Something was rising. You stood beside the lantern, unlit, cradling the book in your arms, the mirror. Beside you began to tremble. From the forest, the figures returned, dozens now, perhaps hundreds, their faces still hidden, their feet silent. But this time they did not stop at the base of the hill. They began to climb, Dot, slowly, Dot, one by one. You did not move. They did not touch you. They gathered around the lantern, forming a silent ring, their heads bowed. A ritual, a farewell, or perhaps a reminder. One stepped forward, arms outstretched, Dot in her palms. The flame, not fire, not heat, but a small orb of light no larger than a plum pulsing blue and violet. She placed it into the lantern's base, Dot. No words, Dot, no gesture, Dot, just the act. And as her hands pulled back, the light began to glow again. The lantern, Humed, Dot. The watchers vanished. And you wept, Dot. You hadn't known how long the flame had burned you from within, how heavy it had become, until that moment when it was returned to you not by force, but by grace. You weren't just the keeper. Now, you were the lantern. You didn't move. Neither did the figure on the far bank. You watched one another across the silver line of the Avail, that ancient river that had once whispered your name and swallowed your memories. And in that quiet, in the hush before dawn, when the mist thinned just enough to allow recognition, you knew with absolute certainty it was you. Or rather, the version of you that had not chosen the flame. They stood just as you did, posture tilted slightly forward, as if listening not to you, but to something behind you. Their robes were dry, their face unlined. There was no soot beneath their fingernails, no ash in the folds of their sleeves. They carried no book, no mirror. Their eyes were clear, untouched by smoke, untouched by centuries. But their presence wavered, flickering slightly, like a reflection on rippling water. They were not here, not fully, and still they waited. Dot. It was not a threat, not a plea. It was a possibility. Dot, the choice that might have been. You took one step forward, the grass damp under your bare feet. The lantern behind you gave no resistance. It did not flare or hum. It simply glowed, steady and low, like a parent watching a child take their first breath. The river remained silent. You could not hear its voice any more, not the whispers, not the ancient murmurings. Whatever watched from beneath had returned to its deeper dreaming, but that did not mean it had forgotten. That did not mean it would remain asleep forever. The flame would still be needed. The boundary would always need tending. But whether you would be the one to do it, that now was yours to decide. You sat at the base of the lantern and placed the mirror before you, cracked, veined, scarred with time, but still intact enough to hold an image. You stared not into it, but through it. The reflection showed only the flame, no watchers, no river, no child, no doors. Just light. And it was beautiful. You took the book in your hands and held it to your chest. It pulsed gently like a heartbeat, trying to match your own. Its weight was no longer heavy. It was earned. Every page, every whisper, every moment beneath the stars yours. Not given, chosen. Remembered. Dot, and in the soft hush of that moment, you heard something. Not aloud. Dot, inside. Dot, a voice. Not ancient, not distant, but familiar. Yours. Dot, it said, very softly, you are not the end. You are the keeper of endings. You are not the flame. You are the breath that lets it live. You closed your eyes. You could walk away now. Others would come. The watchers would find a new child. The hill would call again, or you could stay. Not as the one who waits, but as the light itself. Dot, to leave behind the flesh. The book, the bones. Dot, to become flame. Dot, to become remembrance. The grass swayed gently around you, though there was no wind. Dot, the lantern. Mad. Dot, and across the river the other you stepped back, disappearing slowly into fog. No sadness, no resistance, just fading. The choice had been made. You stood, lifted the mirror in both hands, and held it high to the lantern's light. The flame reached for it. Not with fire, not with heat. Dot, with recognition. The glass cracked once more. Dot, and then it was gone. The mirror vanished in silence, not shattering, not falling, just ceasing to exist. Like a dream that has been remembered too long, it dissolved into nothing. And yet you did not feel loss. You felt only release. The moment it disappeared, the flame within the lantern shifted. Not in color, not in size, but in tone. It no longer pulsed like a call across the veil. Now it pulsed like a heart. Yours. The book fell open one final time. But this time there were no words, no sketches, no diagrams. Only light. The pages had turned translucent, the ink fading, until what remained was not story, but glow. A soft shimmer that lit the space around it, like morning through thin linen. You ran your hand over it one last time, not reading, but feeling as though the pages had nothing left to tell you because you had already become their author. You walked slowly to the base of the lantern and placed the book there beside the ring of ashes from 100 nights of incense. You knelt for the last time, not in submission, but in honor. The hill was still. The air no longer tasted of smoke or salt or old secrets. It tasted clean, like spring rain after a long winter, and the flame leaned toward you. A small part of you, buried deep inside, still expected it to burn, to sting, to blind, to destroy. But it didn't. When it touched your chest, it felt like warmth rising through your veins. It felt like memory that had always been there, just forgotten, until now. You did not gasp. You did not flinch. You closed your eyes and let it return. To you, the first memory was a mother's lullaby, the same song the wind had carried through the trees when the watchers first appeared. You saw her face for the first time, kind, strong, her eyes tired, but shining. She had lit the flame once too. She had watched it alone on this very hill. Not in your lifetime, but in yours the second memory was of the river. Not as it was now, but before it whispered, before it pulled, before it held anything in its depths. It had been a gift then, a mirror of the sky, and you had bathed in it, unafraid, with others whose faces you could not name, but whose laughter lives in your bones. The third was the flame itself, not as fire, but as promise. A light born, not to burn, but to hold. It had been passed from voice to voice, from hand to hand, not to destroy darkness, but to remind the dark that it could not consume everything. You remembered the first keeper, and the second, and the 10th. You remembered yourself again and again, climbing the hill in 1,000 forms, with 1,000 names, under countless skies, all of it leading to now Dot, and now you stood, and you glowed Dot, not brightly, not blinding, but steadily Dot as the flame rose into you, through your chest, through your throat, into your eyes. Your body remained, but your name dissolved, not forgotten, fulfilled. You no longer needed it. Names were for pages, for mirrors, for stories still in motion. You were no longer a chapter. You were the binding. The book closed behind you. No hand turned the cover. It simply knew it was done. The wind stirred once more, hurling through the grass like a blessing. The watchers did not return. They had no need. Their circle was complete, and below in the village, though no one would speak of it, a single candle flickered to life in a window long thought abandoned. A child awoke from a dream they couldn't describe, and felt safe without knowing why. Somewhere deep in the forest, a wolf lifted its nose to the wind and stepped away from the river's edge. The boundary had held. The hill remained. The flame was no longer in the lantern. Dot, the flame was you. You did not leave. You did not vanish. You remained, and the light, eternal and gentle, burned steady in the dark.